We began looking in our last segment at the Lament Psalms. We saw that the laments are the most common speech form or prayer form or genre in the Psalms. 50 of the Psalms have been labeled as a lament. We saw the basic elements of a lament as well. These Psalms include an address, an introductory cry to God, a lament, a petition, a confession of trust, and a vow of praise. In this segment, we're going to look at some of the other special features of the laments that I'd like for you to pay attention as you read and study these passages this week. The first thing that I wanted us to notice is that one of the special features of the laments that I see as I study them is that the psalmist is often going to give to God a very detailed and vivid description of his troubles. And one example of this, for example, is found in Psalm 22. And the description that the psalmist often provides of his trouble, he uses very poetic language, very evocative figures of speech. It's hyperbolic, it's over the top, it's excessive. It's as if the psalmist wants to impress upon God in the fullest way possible, this is what I'm going through. This is how desperate and how bad my situation is. Now, as Christians, when we read Psalm 22, we think of the crucifixion of Jesus. We think of this being a prophecy of Christ's crucifixion. But if you look at the imagery here, as David is speaking about his own experiences, he uses a number of figures of speech to try to help us to understand the fullness of everything that he's going through and how bad his situation is. He says in verse 12, "Many bulls encompass me, strong bulls of Bashan surround me. They open wide their mouths at me, like a ravening and roaring lion. I am poured out like water, and all of my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax, it is melted within my breast. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to my jaws. You lay me in the dust of death. For dogs encompass me, a company of evildoers encircles me. They have pierced my hands and my feet. I can count all of my bones. They stare and gloat over me. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots." Now, we know that many of those things were specifically experienced by Jesus, but as David is experiencing and talking about his own situation, he's using these different figures of speech. He's being attacked by wild animals. There are enemies who insult him. There are enemies who physically persecute him. He is suffering something that looks like an illness and disease. And all of these images are basically piled on top of each other to help us to understand this is what the psalmist is going through. He wants God to see his pain. And remember that the psalmist is not just always trying to convey information to us. He's trying to make us feel and experience what he's going through. Now, we might ask the question, well, why does he need to tell God what he's going through? God already knows. But part of being able to worship means that we can come to God and be honest with him about whatever's going on in our heart and our life. Part of being able to deal with this pain is being able to express it to God so that we can give it to God and lift it off of our own shoulders. And again, part of this is simply the psalmist trying to impress upon God as deeply as possible, this is how badly I'm hurting. Second feature that I notice in these Psalms that may seem strange to us as we think about prayer is that these Psalms often include very accusatory language toward God. They sound almost like a baseball manager or arguing with an umpire. We might read some of these Psalms and say, can you really talk to God that way? But I think what we understand, again, is that we can bring to God the honest expressions of our hearts, and that these people know God very well if they feel comfortable to talk to him in that way. Craig Broyles, in his book, The Conflict of Faith and Experience in the Psalms, says that we have these kind of accusations toward God or against God in 60 different passages in the Psalms. Sometimes they're expressed in the form of a question to God. Other times they are making an assertion about God. Sometimes the psalmist is charging God with some form of passive neglect. Lord, you haven't taken care of me. You've been asleep as I've been praying. Where are you and why haven't you answered? Other times the psalmist is going to directly charge God with being the cause of his suffering. God, this is something that you have done to me. Even at times when they're being afflicted or persecuted by their enemies, or there's been some defeat in battle or something like that, God is the direct cause of their suffering. One of the more interesting examples of this is found in a communal lament in Psalm 44. In some ways, I like to refer to Psalm 44 as the anti-Psalm 23. Because Psalm 23 talks about how the Lord is my shepherd. Psalm 44 talks about how God has given His people over to be butchered like sheep. And the people, as they come to God and express their hurt to Him, they address some very direct accusations against God because they don't understand what God is doing. There has been some kind of military defeat. Israel has been through a difficult time as a people and a nation, and here's what they say to God. You have sold your people for a trifle and demanded no high price for them. You have made us the taunt of our neighbors, the derision and the scorn of those people around us. You have made us a byword among the nations and a laughingstock among the peoples. All day long my disgrace is before me and shame has covered my face. Now, the problem here is not just that they've experienced this terrible defeat. The real issue in this psalm is that the people in this situation have not done anything to deserve the punishment. They have not disobeyed God. They have not broken His covenant commandments. The military defeat here, it is not the Babylonian exile where they're being punished for their sins. And they say back to God, all of this has come upon us, though we have not forgotten you, and we have not been false to your covenant. Our heart is not turned back, nor have our steps departed from your way. Yet you have broken us in the place of jackals and covered us with the shadow of death. If we had forgotten the name of our God or spread out our hands to a foreign God, would not God have discovered this? Because He knows the secrets of our hearts. They're saying, look, we know that if we had done something that deserved this judgment, we would receive it, we would accept it. But we have not done anything. We have not broken God's commandments. We have not forgotten Him, and we don't understand why has God brought this upon us. And so the Psalms can often express very accusatory language toward God. Third special feature of these lament psalms that I think reflect the depth of the relationship that the psalmist had with God is that they often give God motivations for why God should answer their prayers. Now, in the prophets, God would often give the people motivations. These are why you should obey my commands. In the Psalms, we have almost exactly the opposite, because now the people are presenting the reasons why God should answer their prayer. They're motivating God to answer their prayers. Do we really need to experience things, or do we really need to explain things to God? Well, again, prayer is a personal give and take with God. God wants us to bring our intellect, our reason, our emotions, our entire person into prayer. Prayer is not just something where we drop $2 in the machine and expect an answer. Prayer is a give and take relationship with the God of the universe. And at the deepest level of our being, we're interacting with God. So, as the psalmist presents these motivations for God to answer his prayer, they will often say things like this. In Psalm 6 and Psalm 30, Lord, if you don't deliver me, I'm going to die. And if I die, there will not be anyone to praise you. God, if you don't answer this prayer, there's going to be one less choir member in the chorus. Psalm 7 and Psalm 26, Lord, I'm innocent of wrongdoing, and I don't deserve the suffering that you're bringing into my life. Now, in these Psalms, they're not arrogantly protesting that they're sinlessly perfect. But what they are saying is that they have not done anything in their lives that deserves the depth of suffering and pain that they're going through, and they're asking God to get involved and to do something about it. In other places, the psalmist will say things like, my enemies are wicked and vicious, and they are going to prevail over me, and the bad guys are going to win. The bad guys who hate God and hate His people are going to triumph if you don't do something about this. There are places like Psalm 25 where the psalmist will motivate the Lord by saying, God, your reputation is at stake. And we remember that that's exactly the same kind of motivation that Moses presented to God in the wilderness when God said to Moses, stand back, I'm going to destroy these people. And Moses said to him, but Lord, what about the Egyptians? What are they going to say about you when they hear that you've destroyed your own people? Often the psalmist will appeal to God's character. God, answer me on the basis of your love, your faithfulness, your loving kindness, your covenant promises. And they're reminding God that God has promised within the covenant to act in a certain way. And so we may need to qualify this a little bit, but prayer, real prayer in a sense, often does involve arguing with God. Not like the baseball manager, but in a way where we bring our reasons to God and we present those things to God, and at the same time we bow and submit and say, God, this is my understanding, but I also submit to your sovereignty. We see people praying like that in Scripture. Abraham prays over the 50 righteous people that are in the city of Sodom and Gomorrah. When Hezekiah is told that he's going to die, he offers God reasons why the Lord should deliver him from death. When Jesus is praying to the Father on the night before his crucifixion, he's offering God reasons why he should deliver him from this cup, but ultimately he surrenders to God's will. And so we present our motivations to God. We're involved in him in a deep relational level, but we understand that he's the king and we bow before him. The final thing that I notice in these Psalms is that there is often an extreme shift in mood within these Psalms. One example of this is definitely found in Psalm 28, and I want to real quickly just walk through this. Notice the desperation that the psalm begins with. To you, O Lord, I call. You are my rock. Do not be deaf to me, lest if you be silent to me, I become like those who go down to the pit. Hear the voice of my pleas for mercy when I cry to you for help, when I lift up my hands toward your most holy sanctuary. Do not drag me off with the wicked, with the workers of evil, who speak peace with their neighbors while evil is in their hearts. David is in a desperate situation. He's about to die. He needs deliverance, and he's pouring out his heart to God. But at the end of this psalm, listen to his tone. Blessed be the Lord, for he has heard the voice of my pleas for mercy. The Lord is my strength and my shield. In him my heart trusts. I'm helped and my heart exults. And with my song I will give thanks to him. The Lord is the strength of his people, and he's the saving refuge of his anointed. And so it almost sounds like the psalmist is schizophrenic. He's in the depths of despair at the beginning of the psalm. He's at the heights of praise and exaltation of God at the end. And as scholars and interpreters have looked at the Lament Psalms, they've tried to explain these shifts in tone. Some have suggested that the priest had given to the psalmist an oracle promising God's answer to his prayer and God's deliverance. We see that kind of thing with Hannah in 1 Samuel 1. She's praying, pouring out her heart to God because she hasn't been able to have a child, and the priest promises that she'll have a son. That may have happened in some cases. In other places, some have argued that the lament was written after the psalmist was in trouble. And that may be the case as well. The psalmist writes this in retrospect to help people as they are going through the trouble. But I think another explanation for at least some of these psalms is that even in the depths of their despair, the psalmist was able to hold on to his faith and his confidence in God. They knew God well enough to pray in the deep, emotional, personal ways that we've seen here, but they also knew God deeply enough to know that they could trust him in the midst of this trouble. As we stated in the last segment, I believe that one of the benefits of the laments is that they help us to be honest with God, and they help us to worship in a deep level. And I think as we look at these special features and characteristics of the Psalms, we can learn a lot about worship. We can learn a great deal about prayer, and we can understand that God gives us the freedom to come to him and to pour out our hearts to him.